Thank you for downloading this edition of Start the Week with me, Anne McElvoy. Hello. Suburbia has a PR problem, which is odd as so many of us live in areas that don't count as urban or properly rural. The first wealthy Roman suburbans were described by Cicero. But in the 1930s, as Britain's suburbia spread, George Orwell portrayed its glum residents in Coming Up for Air, while more recently the Pet Shop Boys conjured up a hell of anonymity and lurking crime in suburbia. To delve behind the prim facade of Acacia Avenue, I'm joined by Adam Thirlwell, a novelist whose latest work, Lurid and Cute, is a suburban noir tale of hipster hijinks. Joining him round the table are Nick Hubble, who teaches English at Brunel University and specialises in examining social change and the impact of suburbia's creep. The American illustrator Richard McGuire's mesmeric take on everyday life is known to New Yorker readers, and a book based on his strip entitled Here channels thousands of years of American life through drawings of a single house. And the Belfast-born photographer Hannah Starkey has curated an exhibition at London's Hayward Gallery looking at the giddy cocktail of modern identity, consumerism, and where the poor old individual fits into all that. Adam, your novel doesn't tell us where it's set. It's not even the country, but it's definitely a suburban vibe. You grew up in Bushey, just outside London. I'm not suggesting it's a self-portrait, all that adultery and lavender granitas that goes on.
It's true, I'm a kid of the North London suburbs, and it's true that the sort of suburban landscape this book takes place in is not specifically localised to Bushey, where I grew up. And that was really because partly I think I wanted everyone to sort of see themselves in this, and also because I think for me the suburban landscape is almost international, that this sort of this strange hybrid of kind of countryside and hypermarkets and tennis centres. This is something that actually you see almost everywhere in a country, and so I wanted it to be this kind of slightly, like, have this international vibe.
Well, it does have that international vibe, and suburbia around the planet is expanding very, very fast indeed. But when we come across the suburban hero or anti-hero, we often expect a kind of everyman from Mr. Pooter onwards. But your everyman is somewhat different, isn't he? He's an unashamed hipster, sort of boho, not very attractive in many ways, rather spoiled, justifies many dubious moral positions from mere adultery to covering up drug overdoses. That's a very different view of suburbia to perhaps the one that we've expected behind the privet hedge.
It's true, it's a little different to George Grossmith, but I guess what the theme of this book is a sort of sense of being lost. Like, I think this is about a character who feels completely lost in their own life, this sense that real life is happening elsewhere, and I think that's a very specific kind of suburban sense, that suburbia is often this landscape where everyone thinks that kind of the grand events of history or politics are taking place somewhere else. So in that sense, I think, yeah, he's full of dubious moral propositions and articulating moral justifications for some terrible deeds. But it was that sense of lostness, of trying to then actually find rules for living.
That's to me what permeates the book. And there's a line that goes something like, the juggernaut of meaning wasn't parked heavily on his lawn. As if to say that there are so many people sort of living these lost, rather floating lives. But is that how you feel about suburbia, or just the human condition full stop?
I don't know if it's specifically just suburbia, but I certainly think it's something I saw in certainly my generation, in people I was kind of growing up with, and there's obviously kind of almost a specific sociological thing certainly here, this idea that, you know, this is a character living with his parents, he doesn't really have a job. There's a kind of a sense that kind of these grand words like career and future and utopia, they don't exist for him in the same way as maybe for a previous generation. But on the other hand, I sort of feel that it is a universal condition, that everyone knows what it's like to feel completely adrift.
Lost in the suburbs of the mind. Richard, we'll come to your graphic novel in a moment, but there are definitely parallels here, aren't there, with that sense of specific place, which is also every place.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly what I was trying to do, was trying to make it not a specific place. I suppose the more I developed the novel version, because it was originally a 6-page version which I made before, but the novel, I felt I had to really dig in the actual city where I grew up in. Has all these layers of history, so you know, there was the Native Americans lived there for 11,000 years before the Dutch had moved in, and
so it's the excavation of the suburban ideal and the idea of the house. Your house is your castle that fascinates you.
Yes.
And Nick, this example of suburban noir, just saying to Adam, it's not Mr. Pusher, is it? But that's also quite interesting, the way that we have certain expectations of suburbia. When they're disrupted, we say, oh, that's funny, that's not real suburban novel.
I think it's been changing. It's changed over the period in which we know suburbia. I mean, as you said at the beginning, we've had suburbs since the Roman times, but I don't think we had suburban living then in the recognisable way. I mean, that's something that began to start at the end of the 19th century, as reflected in Mr. Pooter's adventures and his ne'er-do-well son Lupin, you know, and the kind of that concern with the kind of youth culture, which in some way actually shadows, you know, Adams. Obviously the late 19th century equivalent of getting to know good would be rather different, but I think you could still see that. And then it becomes more conservative, if you like, in the interwar period when 2.5 million new homes were built around London, and because of the electrification of the railways, basically, which allowed people to commute in and out. And I think that's when you got that kind of slightly conservative set of values. One thing, it was promoted by Stanley Baldwin, Conservative Prime Minister at the time. He talked about, you know, the sound of the cuckoo in the country and the anvil, you know, while they're selling these suburban homes for about £750, you know, on good mortgage deals. The builders were working with the mortgage lenders to kind of encourage this. And I think these areas became conservative because everybody was coming from a different background.
Hannah, when you look in your work at consumption and consumerism, which we'll delve into a bit more later, they also define the characters in Adam's book. I lost count of the very enjoyable ways that people are sort of skewered by something that they drink or eat or consume or wear, as if their identity were floating, but we could pin it momentarily by a kind of cocktail that they drink.
Well, I think that's the thing about consumerism and advertising, is it's brainwashed us into thinking that our status symbols say something about us, about our personalities. And I think probably the suburbs, it's built on status symbols, like who has the newest car or who has this or who has that. It's the sort of one-upmanship. So I think that it's the status symbols that play the biggest role in suburban life.
But there, Adam, is that sort of tension about the suburbs, which is that people seem to like to live there. They might want to be, or at least be content to be part of this, whether it's aspirational or consumerist, as Hannah suggests there. But what about the kind of moral underpinning of this? You describe your character as a superhero of thinking, by which I don't think you mean that he's a mastermind championship. He continually thinks around things, delves into them, absolves himself of responsibility along the way.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a kind of, to me, a sort of weightlessness almost in suburbia. And for me, maybe it's just because that's where I grew up, and maybe all childhoods are slightly filled with lethargy and boredom. But for me, it was always a place where something else was kind of about to happen, but never quite. You know, I associate it a lot with waiting.
There's a line, isn't there, about everyone's permanently waiting for a bus or some transport, and how much of life is then spent waiting to get somewhere else.
Exactly. And I think that the thinking, therefore, in this novel is partly a reflection of that there's a sort of sense that thinking in suburbia takes over from doing. And so I think one of the sort of comic aspects of the book for me was this disparity between, on the one hand, this, you know, hyper-articulate moral thinking and kind of slight lethargy, but that actually, rather than leading to nothing happening, leads to more and more sort of lurid and outlandish kind of plot things happening.
And lurid and outlandish, as you say, but that sort of expectation that we have that there's the hipsters live in the city centre and misbehave continually, and then you go to the suburbs to settle down. Does that seem to you not to be something that's frayed across? You talked a bit about generational.
Well, I think it has frayed, because I think that, you know, certainly I think for my generation there isn't that kind of, you know, the idea of living in the inner city now in your 30s is a distant dream. And so that's interesting, isn't it? The housing market has in some ways expanded the mind of suburbia, because so many different kinds of people are going to live further out. Exactly. So I think that suburbia now is much more almost a landscape. So I think the sort of sociological aspects of it, this idea of status symbols, of, I don't know, a bourgeoisie, I think that is slightly fraying now, so that almost, I suppose what I was trying to do in this book was that to express almost the sort of emotion of suburbia, the kind of melancholy associated with it, as well as the obvious kind of pooterish, that seems to me the kind of surface.
It's that pooter man again. Nick Hubble, you grew up in suburbia, and even from the 19th century, it has been something to laugh at or possibly look down on. Orwell's portrayal in Coming Up for Air is really of a stultifying place. It's deadening to thought and political inquiry, and it's all about convention. But there's a big tension here because suburbs are fantastically aspirational as well.
Well, I think that is the combination. I mean, Orwell was writing specifically in that 30s period from the left, so in some ways he's trying to criticise that kind of Baldwin view of the suburbs. And he tries to, it's all about the kids are always nagging, and the wife is kind of restricting what you do, and you can't swing a cat, and you have to shave in 2 seconds and get on the 737. It's that kind of thing. But he's also trying to get his suburban readership to think, because a lot of the people reading books, all these people in these 2.5 million houses, they're reading Penguin classics and going to the Left Book Club meetings, or some of them, and the people who actually went on after the war to probably vote for the Labour government. So in some ways, he's that potential is also there in the suburbs. So it gets laughed at, but I think there's also, it works because you can laugh at yourself in the suburbs.
Smallest feline aside, cats do seem to figure a lot in work on the suburbs. You have, Adam, a cat that keeps walking through the homemade porno movie. It's happened to us all. Richard, you also have a cat occasionally. Pops in and out of image.
Yes, someone pointed out, I in the first version of my strip, I made the cat walking by just to backtrack a little bit, my book shows multiple views of time in, it's I guess an experimental graphic novel is the only way you can explain it. So you'll see the different windows, and each window has a little date in the corner. And there was a cat walking through in the year 1999, which was a cat in the future in my first version. Now it's a cat in the past, which is very strange. It's walking in two different directions.
The time-travelling feline.
Yes.
But Dick, this idea of suburbia where the cat sort of stalks through it, there's a permanence that we can imagine if you picture a suburban home, whether we did it in Richard's America or in Britain. And yet, at the same time, the suburbs have changed an awful lot, and they're still changing, and many more people on the planet now live in suburbia than did so. Yes,
I think so. I mean, basically, I think if you were an urban geographer, a social geographer, you define everything that's not the city centre and not the isolated rural area as some form of suburb. Not necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily call it a suburb, but what's going on there is suburban life, or they call it sort of a rural suburb, or an outer urban suburb, or whatever. There's different ways of describing it, but it's all kind of suburbs, and I think that has changed because now you're talking about what everybody's doing. So
is it time for a redefinition?
I think the suburban century was the one we've just had, the 20th century, and now they're kind of changing. I think for some of the reasons that Adam discusses in his book, that there's not the same sense of aspiration. It's not. I mean, just that point of the 30-somethings not looking to live in the city indicates the way it's changing, because there always used to be this kind of suburban churn. New people went into the middle, new people went out. And in Britain, that's made, it's dispersed kind of multicultural societies. It's dispersed sort of kind of liberal ideas from the metropolis, and it's, other ideas that come in the other way. It makes Britain a kind of great changing driver.
Do you feel you should be championing even suburbia? Do you feel it needs a reboot?
I think it needs a reboot now, because it's got to the point where that kind of lifespan has reached its end, perhaps obviously with the kind of economic crash. People are no longer moving out so much. It's becoming more of a kind of set off aside area.
Hannah?
Well, it's interesting, actually. I agree with everything you're saying about suburbia, but my experience of it is very different. I grew up in suburbia, which was actually only 10 minutes out of Belfast city centre. And it's interesting that you were saying that 86% of us live in suburbia. I mean, most of us are suburbanites. But growing up in Belfast in suburbia, it was an area that allowed that kept bigotry and hatred out through education and aspiration. So my mum worked her fingers to the bone her whole life to try and keep us out of the direct line of fire of the situation in Belfast. And, you know, it is very interesting, especially in Belfast, where you have communities and houses that sort of clash up together, and the demarcation is the flag colours painted on the curbs. And you always knew when you were in a middle class area, because there was no demarcation, that we all lived together. And it was, I suppose, an ideology that served very well. It helped people, because if you think about it, Northern Ireland was done for 40 years. So it was very important that there was that aspiration, that possibility of getting out of the ghetto and educating yourself out of bigotry and hatred.
I think that's a particularly striking example of a kind of demarcation, if you like, between the paint on the curb, or the lack of it, between the suburbs and the city. And I think your previous novels have been set in the city, or more in city centres. Do you feel that there's a kind of mental demarcation line between cities and suburbs, even if not as dramatically as in Hannah's native Belfast?
I definitely think that's true, but also I think what's interesting is if most of us have grown up in suburbs, it means that even the people living in city centres will often maybe have come from suburban upbringings, or kind of that they're. I think you can't quite make such a kind of massive demarcation. And I think what's interesting, I'm just thinking kind of what Nick was saying as well, is that I think there's almost a self-condescension that, like, we all come from, many of us come from these areas. And I think what's strange is how much it's seen as just a purely comic phenomenon, as it were. And I think what I was certainly interested in this book was thinking, but there is actually a way of moral thinking that's specific to the suburban kind of landscape, that actually the problems of how do you live, you know, if actually you feel that things are slightly kind of far away, or if you're not really living the true life. And what I really wanted to think about was, well, maybe actually this is the true life, that, you know, the moral problems you come up against every day in an ordinary landscape, those are the major kind of problems of kind of ethics and politics, and actually that therefore the major issues are never as far away as you think.
And Nick, do you think that this then bleeds into politics? I'm thinking back to the 1997 election, when New Labour, as it then freshly minted, was set out to reconnect with suburban aspirations. Philip Gould's book on how New Labour should reinvent itself explicitly said that. It went after Mondeo Man, you know, remember the days of Mondeo Man, or whatever he is now driving. But how do you think that still plays into politics? We're coming up to an election now. Is that suburban aspiration still seen as something that you can put on the marketing board?
I think it's still on the marketing board, because so many of us live in the suburbs, and particularly, I mean, in a British election context, you're talking about the greater London suburbs and the outlying, you know, something like half the population live within an hour's drive at the outskirts of London. So obviously that's a key area in that aspect. I don't think it's quite so aspirational now, because now I think the battleground now is to say we're going to try and protect your living standards. I don't think people are offering improvement at the moment. So I think that makes it a more defensive area. And I don't think that same... people are not moving in and out perhaps in quite the same way, because as Adam was saying, you can't get in the centre because the centre of London's becoming extremely expensive. I think that changes the dynamics.
But does that change the suburbs if they are in different economic times about holding on to what you have rather than aspiring to,
I think
the Cicero villa?
I think it's changing the kind of point. The point of it, if you like, we were talking about the moral aspect, and there's a nice bit in Adam's book where he says something like, the real moral question is that people are not the same person all the time. And I think that was the attraction of the suburbs. You could be different people in the suburbs because it separated the private off of the public. So you had the opportunity to be your home self, be yourself at the tennis club or do the sports or whatever. And it could allow, for example, the kind of things Hannah was talking about in the suburbs of Belfast. You could be different types of people and get along. I think that's changing. I think now you're getting a more concrete mindset. So,
do you think of the suburbs as aspirational? Do you think of your characters, Richard McGuire, as aspirational in their actually rather lovely house? I got a bit of a house envy reading your book. House envy lasting several centuries.
Well, I don't know about aspirational, but I think, you know, I mean, everything in the book is centered around these little tiny little moments rather than anything.
it's neat, isn't it? There's an order to it. I mean, many things that disrupt that order. Like the book takes us backwards and forwards in time in a Lewis Carroll way that we can find ourselves dealing with Native Americans, or Benjamin Franklin having a conversation with his son, or the tensions of the Civil War. But then we're also catapulted back to around, just to take an example, 1989, and a family sitting watching the television and telling a joke, which sort of goes on through several frames and begins to introduce us to. But there's an orderly existence there.
Yes. I don't know how to expand on that.
Well, I suppose my question, but you'd say something else if you like, but I wondered how much you thought this was about a sort of aspirational America focused in this one house.
It wasn't a concern of thinking about it in terms of any aspirational idea. It was just, kind of based on my own family life, and then trying to show the multiple layers of that space.
So time and the idea of time, generations, people, if you like, that we're here for a relatively short time in our houses, suburban or otherwise, interests you more than the sociology or precise politics of these characters.
I mean, even that Ben Franklin moment is just reduced to an argument of a father and son across the street. It was not meant to be, even though it's like a microcosm of the formation of the planet.
But it is fascinating to see, if we take it's a graphic novel here, it brings all the world together into the corner of the suburban living room, when we journey through time with family moments that overlap. The dinosaurs, as I said, sort of wander in. There are arguments about the Civil War, but there's just daily life as well, and sometimes we can shoot from like a time portal from one place to another. It must have been fascinating to research what had happened in that location.
Yeah, there are certain things that are actually in the book that actually did happen, like the archaeologists who came to my home and wanted to dig up the backyard for Indian bones, and my mother wouldn't let them do it because she didn't want to disrupt her garden. But I just love the multi-dimensional view of that one space.
Explain the construction of the novel, if you can, because we open it up and it's pictures, obviously very beautifully drawn pictures of the house, these sharp angles of this room, but then pictures get overlaid with other pictures. There's also an interactive version of this book, I should say, and it feels like it's always
It's hard to talk about these things on the radio, but it's if you open up the book, and just imagine that an open book is the corner of the room. So the double page spread is the entire room, and in the upper left corner you see a date that tells you what year you're in, and then on top of that is, if you can imagine, smaller windows, and each window has a date in its upper left corner, so you can see multiple views of the same space, and the camera is always a locked view of that space.
And how much of that is inspired by opening up, now that we all open up tabs and windows in our
Well, it was inspired originally from someone showing me their Windows program. This was back in 1988. So I had the idea of actually using a corner of a room because I thought I was going to do a story that's going forward in time on one side and backward in time on the other. But as soon as I saw that Windows program, that's when I thought, I could use multi-dimensional views of time.
Hannah.
And I love that idea because it's not linear. And in a way, that corner of the house is what houses our personal memories. And then we as people house history, that it affects us. So what I loved about your room is that the details change, but the drama stays the same, the human drama over the centuries. And, sometimes when I was looking at your book, I really had that feeling of when I walk into maybe a room in my own house, and I'm very aware that I am making memories. I'm scanning the room to see the details, the objects that relate to that time and that experience. And it fascinates me that, these corners house stories. They're like the walls could speak idea. They would say really quite interesting things. And also the fact that the human drama is made up from the minutiae of life, the
Right.
tiny details, or the significant moments like birthday parties and that sort of thing. And that is so accessible and so poignant, how you've managed to collapse space and time through your graphic interpretation of a corner of the room.
And here does that telescoping, doesn't it, where the big and the small can be given equal weight, or even sometimes you feel almost inverted weight, that your eye is drawn to a very tiny detail.
Well, that was one of the mottos I was using when I was making the book, was to make the big things small and the small things big. But
Why do you do that?
I think because I was trying to go for this undocumented tiny moment that we, all... I mean, there are all these shared experiences that, like when you mention like birthday parties, it's like, you look at family photos, and many family photos have this similar feeling about them. I went through archives of a guy who collects exactly that, these kind of family photos, and they all started to look like we were saying.
Well, they do repeat, don't they? It's the same ritual and patterns.
Yeah.
Nick Hubble, I know you've worked with the Mass Observation Archive, which sounds sort of slightly more threatening than I think it really is. But really, a research about ageing and about how societies change and how small events can tell us very big things about the way that we live. It just basically records everyday life.
Well, that's true. It's a kind of the current Mass Observation Project is a longitudinal life writing project that's run since 1981, and people, many of them who've been doing it since 1981, write in three or four times a year in response to kind of open-ended questions. And one of the things would be, what is your house like? What is your room like? And there's actually one. They did one year, and people are sent in all sorts of photographs, or drawn their rooms, or drawn their mantelpieces, and it does give exactly that same effect. Also, given that there was an original mass observation in 1937, so you can compare the mantelpieces today with the mantelpieces then. And I thought there was a kind of surrealist kind of connection.
That's heaven for Richard McGuire, isn't it? I mean, mantelpieces from 1937 to the present day. What more?
I love it.
Yeah, I think that, because what I was thinking when I was looking at Richard's book was, it reminded me a bit of Magritte, actually. And Magritte's On the Threshold of Liberty, which is a painting of squares, and some of which are extreme close-up, and some of which are sort of very distant sceneries, and the idea of sort of space opening up. And this was kind of like the more everyday suburban version of that. It seemed to me we're going right back into the extreme past, but also into the there was hope for the future. One screen, the house gets flooded, doesn't it? You're imagining a kind of... but then further in the future, I think it's 2213 or something, there's boardwalks over it, and, there's a society going on. And there's a nice utopian... Well, there's a sense of the future there, anyway, which is good.
There is a sense of the future, Richard, but there's also an intensely personal sense about it. When I heard about the project, I'd imagined that this was just a house in your mind. And then I realised that it is in fact your old family home. So in the first page, he's packing up boxes because parents have died. Flick to the next page, and you're being born. So it's intensely personal as well as having that big kaleidoscopic view.
Yeah, I make a point to say it's not a memoir, but there really are. I mean, I used a lot of family photos, and there are some intimate moments. But I definitely wanted to make it feel like so everyone can relate. So it's
that tug of the personal positioning of the picture on the mantelpiece and more. Adam, did you find as you were reading this, as you were looking through the book, that it reminded you of this impermanence and this shifting feeling about life, which is also there, I think, in your pages?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a real poignancy actually to the book, because there's something so lovely in seeing, on the one hand, as it were, everyone's different furniture, everyone's different mantelpieces, and on the one hand that seems to be so individual and that everyone will think of that as their specific arrangement, and then it's just revealed as just another furniture arrangement, and that that there is, or actually something that's happening in the middle of a sort of what's really tundra and kind of apocalypse. And I think there were definitely similarities. I was thinking, because I think in Lurid and Cute, there's a huge interest in kind of in the here and now, in that actually the only thing that's really meaningful is what's happening right now. And I was thinking, like with Richard's book, you could have called it Now as much as Here. That like there's that concern with sort of just the present moment. I felt incredibly envious actually reading this book, because I was thinking the graphic novel form enables so much more. I was thinking, what's the equivalent novelistically of these inset kind of sudden wormholes.
Yeah, the medium does. That's one strength of the medium, is that simultaneousness that you can get.
Yeah, I think
if you had to write
equivalent.
that, you would have to write it in one, like, meanwhile, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah.
It would
you
be
don't
very
get
clunky.
Yes.
I think I was thinking
Well, you'd
maybe
be like
the
Virginia
simile.
Woolf, wouldn't you? You have so many narrative strands and time levels going on that you'd either have to explain or the reader has
Yeah.
to work quite hard.
Yeah, because I think the clarity enriches, but that's what's so lovely is that I think in words it would be much more difficult to organise in a way that the reader could understand. And I was thinking like this kind of telescoping, I think maybe in the similes you can do this, that suddenly in a simile in a book you can sort of trampoline out of kind of
You've
what
been accused of having too many similes, but you love similes, don't you? The wilder the better. But are you standing up in defence of the wild simile?
Well, I think in this book the interest for me with the similes was to show this kind of character's thinking, that that to see this idea that this character is constantly worrying about
The sort of trigger of the mind.
the trick of the mind, and also the multiple worlds that they could be inhabiting. And I suppose it was also, I think this book is deliberately kind of in this universal place, and so the similes were a way of trying to kind of expand the single kind of location of the book.
It's either that or taking
many
up
other
the skills
places.
of a graphic novelist.
Exactly. That will
Probably
never happen.
take quite a long time to acquire. Well, if Richard captures the changes that have happened since the beginning of life on Earth in his single room, the exhibition at the Hayward Gallery that Hannah Starkey has contributed to, or rather curated a section of it, is perhaps a bit more modest in scope. 7 artists have been asked to look after a section of the exhibition that looks at Britain's cultural history from 1945 to the present day. Hannah, your period is the 1970s to the 1990s, and you found your material by delving into the Arts Council's collection of photographs from that time. What were you looking for?
Well, during that period, the Arts Council were the main funders and supporters of photography that was outside the commercial remit. So they collected almost an idiosyncratic idea of photography's development from the 70s to the 90s, and the development was quite extreme in the history of photography, 150 odd years. Because from the 70s to the 90s, photography changed radically, and one of the major shifts was it became part of the art world, and it took its place on the major gallery walls, and it sort of fought its corner. So I am a photographer. I've been a photographer since I studied GCSE photography as a teenager, which was such a brilliant thing to have happened to me, because I was very dyslexic at school, but still wanted to communicate something about my experience and to communicate to others, which essentially is what we're all doing. And photography allowed me to do that.
There's an interesting mix in the part of the exhibition that you've looked after between very intense kind of consumerist images about advertising, which are fascinating to look at, and also how well we remember them. I could almost remember where I was when I saw a certain makeup advert from the 1970s.
Or Hello Boys.
Hello Boys, who could forget Hello Boys? But then also the way that these adverts then become sort of part of a changing society. So we have the Marlboro Man, who use a lot of smoking advertising, and we see how that has changed. And then we have the challenge to it, and what Marlboro Man says to the other, I've got emphysema. So we do see the sort of changing values and preferences of the society through what you've got there.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure there are values necessarily. I think there may be ones that are put on us or sold to us, or going back to suburbia, you're not successful if you haven't got this, this and this in terms of status symbols.
Could it be sold to us if we didn't want it?
I don't. You see, the thing about advertising, I love advertising, and there's some brilliant advertising out there. And in the 90s, when I left college, I was asked to work on some advertising as well as across the board fashion and art. And it's such an exciting medium because it's instant, it's subliminal, so it's very powerful. And from my perspective, we're all very visually sophisticated and literate, and we decipher images so quickly, particularly adverts, because they're designed in that way. And sometimes we do it sort of passively, where we're not even aware of the information we're consuming.
But at the same time, you've put these alongside pictures which were really not commercial, or
No.
commercial in that sense. The one that caught my eye was from my native part of the world, actually from Chris Killip's Young Skinhead in Jarrow. It was his youth, eyes clenched, coiled up on this wall, looking at once very tough, but also incredibly vulnerable. And I wondered what had brought you to that, whether it was that sort of deconstruction of toughness, masculinity, the skinhead, something we all think we kind of know about, a bit nervy about.
Well, yes, I mean, I particularly like Chris Killip's photography, although he doesn't call himself a documentary photographer. I think what he's getting at is they're more emblematic of a state of mind. And his work in particular, it's very honest, and it's not invasive. And why I chose this particular picture of the frustrated boy is for me it's emblematic in some way of how the pressures that we put on kids, teenagers, to conform to ideas of gender and then to perform those in society. And I think it's such advertising offers us such extreme ideas on gender that you maybe possibly get quite lost with that if you don't conform.
Yeah, I'm wondering if how that actually sort of changes over that period, because the documentary, I associate documentary with a kind of a post-war kind of working class kind of collective kind of values, and obviously the period you've curated is the bit where that kind of shifts, and it's almost as though the advertising comes in a gap where there's a gap that's not there, and somehow we get pulled into a world of kind of consumerism. There's not the, if you like, the more utopian, open-ended verdict that's not trying to sell us the product. I don't know.
Well, in advertising, it is pretty much based on exaggeration and the idea that they create a problem, which we didn't even realise we had, or a need, and then fill it. So I think what I was trying to do with showing documentary, and it's not just documentary, it sort of starts off in the 70s as documentary, because that's generally what was made, and documentary is art. But then it moves more to, in the sort of late 70s and the 80s, there was more female photographers come in and speak about feminist issues. And then by the time the 90s hit, that's when advertising really influences photography.
I want to stay on feminism and on the images of women, because there's one very striking one in the exhibition, and you're also well known for your staged photographs of women in everyday situations, and you've chosen quite a lot of work by other women in this exhibition, and the relationship between women and photography isn't always very easy, is it? I think the one that leapt out at me challenging that is Mrs. Mancho, who is the mother, I think, of the photographer who took this image, who is a very confident-looking older woman, but really sort of portrayed absolutely as she is. Certainly none of the airbrushing about the ageing female body.
Well, I agree, actually. There's a sincerity and integrity to Melanie Monchon's image of her mum, or photograph of her mum. And I also think that, it's the relationship between the photographer and the subject. And photography has shaped women since its invention. It's told us how we should look. It's told us how we are, how we behave. That influence, the power that the photographer has on the subject.
Did you think of that image as challenging all that photography that tells you how to look?
I find it really challenging, because it also talks about a different definition of beauty, and a wider definition of beauty that we aren't exposed to in advertising.
Richard, it reminded me a bit of the way that the women throughout your book come up as a sort of series of women, also in everyday situations, holding their babies, dancing, that sense of connection between the generations. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the things that you've got there in Mrs. Mancho, is that she's the mother. Well,
she's the mum, and my mum would have done the same. She'd have done anything for me if it would help me. And it's that relationship, that sort of belief that somebody has on you. And I think, it's amazing that an image can transmit all of that and resonate with the viewer.
Adam Thirlwell.
Yeah, and slightly contrasting with that, I think one of the other images in this show you created that I think is so striking is by Homer Sykes, this picture of two women in Pinner Fair in like 60. I think it's dated to about 75. And it's some kind of strip show or kind of beauty pageant, and they're slightly covering their genitals.
Yes.
And it really struck me partly because of the sort of and there's also a silhouette of, I think, a man's head just right in the foreground. And so it's a wonderful photo of kind of the objectification of women and how uncomfortable they look.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the male consuming gaze that women have been subjected to in advertising. I think.
But isn't it doubly incongruous because we've got Pinner in there, because we have this place that we think of as being suburban order? I'm not saying it wouldn't have been a powerful image anyway on that front, but it is that you immediately think, what are they doing getting their kit off in Pinner? Yeah,
because I remember Pinner Fair, as it were, when I was, it's certainly different. When I was there, it was just a load of kind of merry-go-rounds and so sort of the difference 20 years later was really striking to me.
Well, probably that culture goes hand in hand with the enjoying yourself, and it depends on the definition or what it is that you seek for enjoyment, and it caters to every punter, probably.
And the gaudiness. The whole idea of what we objectify and how we do it is, just be very quick on this, but one of the idea of taking, say, John Hilliard's work, in which you have 4 images and you can look at them, it's a body on a beach. You think you know what's happened, and of course you get a different frame and you realise you didn't know at all. That idea of defying objectivity. Yeah, well, absolutely. It's a great picture for that, because it reminds us to look with a critical eye when we're enjoying photography. I mean, we all have a very special relationship with photography in the way that we don't have with any other art form. And I think, it's so close to us that we can really pick quite intimate details from it. Well, thank you very much there, Hannah Starkey. And to all my guests, Nick Hubble from Brunel University, Adam Thirlwell's Lurid and Cute, and Richard McGuire's Here are both out now. And History Is Now, 7 Artists Take on Britain, co-curated by Hannah Starkey, opens at the Hayward Gallery in London tomorrow. Next week, Andrew Marr tackles political intrigue and the lure of soft power. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for listening, and you can get more podcasts from the BBC Radio 4 website.
In this, and also because I think for me the suburban landscape is almost international, that there's sort of this strange hybrid of kind of countryside and hypermarkets and tennis centres. This is something that actually you see almost everywhere in a country, and so I wanted it to be this kind of slightly, have this international vibe. Well, it does have that international vibe, and suburbia around the planet is expanding very, very fast indeed. But when we come across the suburban hero or anti-hero, we often expect a kind of everyman from Mr. Pooter onwards. But your everyman is somewhat different, isn't he? He's an unashamed hipster, sort of boho, not very attractive in many ways, rather spoiled, justifies many dubious moral positions, from mere adultery to covering up drug overdoses. That's a very different view of suburbia to perhaps the one that we've expected behind the privet hedge. It's true, it's a little different to George Grossmith, but I guess... Thank you for downloading this edition of Start the Week with me, Anne McElvoy. Hello. Suburbia has a PR problem, which is odd as so many of us live in areas that don't count as urban or properly rural. The first wealthy Roman suburbans were described by Cicero. But in the 1930s, as Britain's suburbia spread, George Orwell portrayed its glum residents in Coming Up for Air, while more recently the Pet Shop Boys conjured up a hell of anonymity and lurking crime in suburbia. To delve behind the prim facade of Acacia Avenue, I'm joined by Adam Thirlwell, a novelist whose latest work, Lurid and Cute, is a suburban noir tale of hipster hijinks. Joining him round the table are Nick Hubble, who teaches English at Brunel University and specialises in examining social change and the impact of suburbia's creep. The American illustrator Richard McGuire's mesmeric take on everyday life is... Or in certainly my generation, in people I was kind of growing up with... And there's obviously kind of almost a specific sociological thing, certainly here, this idea that, this is a character living with his parents, he doesn't really have a job. There's a sense that kind of these grand words like career and future and utopia, they don't exist for him in the same way as maybe for a previous generation. But on the other hand, I sort of feel that it is a universal condition, that everyone knows what it's like to feel completely adrift.
lost in the suburbs of the mind. Richard, we'll come to your graphic novel in a moment, but there are definitely parallels here, aren't there, with that sense of specific place, which is also every place.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly what I was trying to do, was trying to make it not a specific place. I suppose the more I developed the novel version, because it was originally a 6-page version, which I made before.
Known to New Yorker readers, and a book based on his strip entitled Here channels thousands of years of American life through drawings of a single house. And the Belfast-born photographer Hannah Starkey has curated an exhibition at London's Hayward Gallery looking at the giddy cocktail of modern identity, consumerism, and where the poor old individual fits into all that. Adam, your novel doesn't tell us where it's set. It's not even the country, but it's definitely a suburban vibe. You grew up in Bushey, just outside London. I'm not suggesting it's a self-portrait, all that adultery and lavender granitas that goes on.
It's true, I'm a kid of the North London suburbs, and it's true that the sort of suburban landscape this book takes place in is not specifically localised to Bushey, where I grew up. And that was really because partly I think I wanted everyone to sort of see themselves in what the theme of this book is a sort of sense of being lost. Like, I think this is about a character who feels completely lost in their own life, this sense that real life is happening elsewhere. And I think that's a very specific kind of suburban sense, that suburbia is often this landscape where everyone thinks that kind of the grand events of history or politics are taking place somewhere else. So in that sense, I think, yeah, he's full of dubious moral propositions and articulating moral justifications for some terrible deeds. But it was that sense of lostness, of trying to then actually find rules for living.
That's for me what permeates the book. And there's a line that goes something like, the juggernaut of meaning wasn't parked heavily on his lawn. As if to say that there are so many people sort of living these lost, rather floating lives. But is that how you feel about suburbia, or just the human condition full stop?
I don't know if it's specifically just suburbia, but I certainly think it's something I saw